First weekend of March Madness is in the books, so it's time to sort through the carnage of everything that took place, as well as look ahead to the Sweet 16 and beyond. That handsome gentleman is Tony Farmer. I am the contractually obligated Joe Fortenbaugh to be here. Pleasure to be with you. Joking aside, Tony, we've already seen two number ones go down. We've seen two number twos go down. Princeton, everyone just assumed they'd be in the Sweet 16. Here we go with the matchup against Creighton. A lot of great stuff opening weekend. Biggest surprise that jumps out to you on the board?
I'd say one that UCLA is doing just fine without Jalen Clark. The other thing that, if you take the Bart Torvik rankings, small sample size, only 2 games, but they're actually the number 1 team according to the analytics through 2 games so far. The other thing for me is the unders. They're hitting at an almost 70% clip for the first 2 rounds, and that's really a symptom of poor shooting. The 3-point shooting is down. About 70% of teams, and when they take the court so far in March Madness, they're shooting worse from 3-point range than they were in the regular season. So that's definitely a trend to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Completely agree. I'd say 3 things that jumped out to me. Number 1, we talked about all these teams that were battling injuries. Houston, UCLA, to your point, Miami, Tennessee. Apparently no problem. They've all advanced past the opening weekend. Number 2, Michigan State. I don't know why I'm surprised at the fact that Michigan State's here. It's Tom Izzo in March. We seem to see this every couple of years. But of all the Big Ten teams that made the tournament, they're the only ones left. And then number 3, it's got to be Tennessee taking out Duke. Duke was an absolute freight train. The only reason I wasn't kind of surprised by that, I actually bet on Tennessee against Duke. And I know people watch and say, here we go, hyping the winners. I had no analytical play. I had been betting against Duke nonstop. I thought they were overvalued. I kept losing. I only bet Tennessee strictly as a spite bet against Duke, and it ended up winning. No analytics, no handicapping, straight spite bet, and I ended up winning there. So I don't know if you want to start incorporating that into your models, but it might be something to pay attention to.
Can we have a little disclaimer that says, don't try this at home at the bottom of the screen?
Right. Right. Do as I say, not as I do. Do as you say, however. When we were coming into the tournament last week and you and I talked, you said flat out, not high at all on Purdue. They go down to Fairleigh Dickinson. You were high on Arkansas, who had been stumbling down the stretch, closing out games. They're alive, getting set to face UConn. Kudos to you, my man. Those were 2 great calls. What do you make of the Boilermakers?
Yeah, I definitely think they're the weakest of the number 1 seeds. And I think this may be too strong of a word, Joe. I think they're a bit of a fraud as a number 1 seed.
Oh, here we go.
I mean, even a team like Arkansas, I could see doing some damage. I mean, from top to bottom, that region to me is the most solid for sure. I appreciate it, Joe. I went to school at Ball State University in Indiana, so I have a lot of Indiana brethren. And a lot of people reached out with some hate mail and some DMs on Twitter that didn't like me kind of selling Purdue. But I think the writing was on the wall. This is a Purdue team. We've seen them do this in prior years. Unfortunately, this wasn't a one-time thing for them, and there were a lot of concerns. As far as Arkansas, I like that they're a balanced team. You mentioned last week that stat about teams that are in the top, 49 and Ken Pom in both offensive and defensive efficiency, how well they do in terms of being national champions. Well, Arkansas is just outside of that range. They're ranked 51st. So this is a team that is balanced, and I like their matchups when, you're playing a team in the tournament. You see so many of these, right? Really good offense and an okay defense, or a great defense and an okay offense. They've got great balance, and I like that.
I think the joke I saw regarding Purdue, and this comes from a buddy of mine who went to Indiana, was that Purdue has put more people on the moon than they have teams in the Final Four. Which I'm not positive I'm getting that right, but if I am, that is a fantastic burn. One of those fantastic in-state rivalry burns. Feel free to file that one away because I think that's true.
I'll put that in my pocket.
Matt Painter did a horrible job coaching at the end of that matchup against Fairleigh Dickinson. It seemed like the last 3 or 4 Purdue offensive possessions were terrible.
I mean, Fairleigh Dickinson is a short team. They're not a tall team at all. And you've got Zach Edey, who's a monster. I don't know what he was thinking. I completely agree.
All right, so let's begin the process of looking ahead. Last week, we talked about, from a betting educational perspective, things people should keep in mind for the opening weekend of the tournament. Now that we're turning our attention to Sweet 16 and the Elite 8, does your approach change at all this time around?
It does. I think in general, you start to lean a little bit more on the favorites. You're going to traditionally see a lot more upsets in the earlier rounds of the tournament. The other thing for me is beware of these unders. I mentioned it earlier. The unders have been hitting. For recreational bettors out there, that doesn't mean just go and blindly bet the unders just because they've been hitting and jump on this bandwagon. The bookmakers have a way of adjusting these lines because they're not just going to let their money bleed out as the public jumps on a trend to take these unders. So I'd be careful. If you put a gun to my head, Joe, and said, Tony, you've got to bet every single game either under or over for these upcoming games, I'm taking all the overs.
Yeah, I mean, especially when teams get into the double bonus with 10 minutes to go, you're just going to feel more confident. Whether or not it ends up losing, you're more confident. Betting unders in the tournament is possibly the greatest grind in all of sports. Like I will win those bets sometimes, and I feel awful at the end at the amount of time it's taken off my life trying to grind that out. I'd say one thing I'd throw at people. Before the tournament started, Houston was your favorite at 5-1. Bama was right behind him at 6-7-1. Now you have Bama plus 350, Houston plus 360. If you're looking to play a favorite, play Bama over Houston. It's not a knock on Houston, but they're priced about the same. I think they're relatively comparable if they were to meet on a neutral court in terms of how they'd be power rated. But look at the path Alabama has versus Houston. Houston still has to contend with the possibilities of Texas, a number 2 seed is still alive, Arkansas, UConn, UCLA, Gonzaga, all alive in the bracket underneath them for who would face them in the Final Four. It's a tough run. Alabama, their 2 seed Arizona is out. Purdue, the number 1 seed that they could possibly face, is out. Marquette, the number 2 seed they could face, is out. Duke is out. The path is better for Alabama. So with the price comparable, I'd be looking to the Crimson Tide over the Cougars when it comes to a futures play on one of the favorites. Speaking of futures plays, let's turn our attention to the market that's reset. Regional winners to make the Final Four or to make the Elite Eight, anything like that, to win the entire dance. What stands out? Any readjusted prices catch your eye?
Joe, I really like UConn at this point. The way they took care of Iona, they won by more than 20. And Iona actually shot, more than 40% from three-point range. If they hadn't, that game would have been even uglier than it actually was. And then look what they did against St. Mary's, which is a really, really strong team. And I actually thought St. Mary's was an underrated team coming into this tournament. So for me, I'm all in on UConn at this point, for sure.
They closed really strong in the second half of both those games. They came into the tournament ranked top 20 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. Only 4 teams did that. Texas, Houston, Alabama, and UConn, all are still alive. So that's a metric you want to pay attention to. I have UConn winning my bracket over Alabama, so I've already made a play on them to win the region. I would put a little bit on Arkansas plus 550 to win the region, just as kind of a minimal hedge against my UConn ticket in the event Musselman and the Razorbacks win this weekend. I'd also look at Kansas State plus 350 to win the East region. I think there's a big tax on Michigan State right now. Izzo in March, Michigan State, here we go. Purdue's out, Duke's out. I don't know how everyone feels about Tennessee. I think ultimately people are looking at Michigan State. Now they've become overvalued. Kansas State would be my play there to win the region at plus 350. I think there's some value on that. All right, so let's turn our attention from the futures bets to the best bets for the Sweet 16. For those of you watching at home, all of Tony's favorite bets for the Madness are posted at oddshark.com. So we'll talk about some here, but if he adds throughout the course of the week and into the weekend, you can find all of that at oddshark.com on his page. So Sweet 16, you've seen the opening lines, you've seen the moves. What are you thinking in terms of some action?
I really like FAU. Right now they're plus 5.5. I actually haven't bet it yet, Joe, because I'm hoping maybe I can hold out and get a plus 6. The line has moved from 4.5 to 5.5. So if you can give me plus 6, I'm going to be all over that. And if it settles and stays at 5.5, I like that there as well. Even a little money line sprinkle on FAU, I think there's really good value. Gonzaga, give me a couple points, plus 2. This is a team that entering the tournament, according to the analytics, they were the best team in basketball. So if you're going to give me plus 2 against a team that has injury concerns like UCLA, even though UCLA has looked really good, I'll take Gonzaga there as well.
That's one of the most intriguing games for me in the next round, just as a watchability standpoint. UCLA's looked so good, but the injuries are going to catch up to them, and Gonzaga has looked absolutely great. So I can't wait to watch that one. 2 bets. I completely agree with Florida Atlantic. I think right now you're in a situation where Tennessee's overvalued. Nobody liked Tennessee. Nobody liked Tennessee at all. Then they beat Duke. Now they're the favorite to win the region. Now they're a big favorite over FAU. They've got elite defense, but they're wildly inconsistent on offense. And Rick Barnes, everyone was quoting his tournament ATS record going into the Duke game because the whole world was picking Duke. Well, now he won and covered that game. Now everyone's on him. He has still struggled. All right, this is a Tennessee team that was big time inconsistent down the stretch. So I like Florida Atlantic. Keep something in mind. Nobody in the business liked Tennessee more this year than Ken Pom. Ken Pom has had them ranked high all year. He has stood by them even when people were knocking Tennessee. He had Tennessee power rated as a favorite over Duke. Now that Tennessee is favored over Florida Atlantic and the market's at 5.5, he only has Tennessee -4. I think that's extremely telling. The other one I throw out there is Kansas State plus the 2 against Michigan State. Love the Michigan State story, but again, you're paying a tax on Tom Izzo in March. And this Kansas State team is legit. They're tough. They just went up against a Kentucky team that crushed them on the glass, and they didn't blink. They just kept firing away, and they buried Kentucky by 6, despite being a 3-point underdog in that game. So I think you got to give them some respect. The Big 12 has shown pretty well in this tournament compared to some other conferences. Final question for you. Your bracket, your champions. You filled it out last week. If you get a redo right now, are you sticking with what you picked or are you making some changes?
Joe, as much as I would love to say, I'm going to stick with what I picked. I'm a man of principles. And I think this is recency bias here. UConn just looks too good. So I had Houston over UConn. At this point, if you gave me a redo, I'd go ahead and take UConn over Houston at this point.
I have UConn over Alabama. I feel pretty good about it. Like, I'm happy with where I am. Alabama looks like a freight train. I almost feel like switching to Alabama over UConn. I also really like Texas to win the region over Houston. Houston, despite the injuries, has still played really well. So that's a matchup I'm holding, but it's a real tentative hold. I'm on ice. So if you start pushing me a little bit, you'll watch me go back. It's not a firm hold. It's a slippery hold. All right, that'll do it. He's Tony Farmer. I'm Joe Fortenbaugh. Remember, you can catch all of his picks over at oddshark.com, where we're going to be rolling out a lot of stuff, not just tournament related, but John Anik's coming up with a preview for UFC 287 as well. Thank you guys for watching. Best of luck with all your action this weekend.